He is the CEO of the Children's Defense Fund. Let me welcome Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson to the Karen Hunter Show.
Thank you so much for having me. Good to be with you, Karen. Good to be with you, Drew.
Yes. You picked up the baton laid down by the great Marion Wright Edelman, who was doing all of the things for the children, which this Children's Defense Fund came out of course, civil rights movement. And the goal was to improve federal policies concerning child welfare and public education systems. Fast forward 50 years, our education system is, to me, in complete shambles. Our kids, this pandemic has exposed, particularly Black kids in certain communities, no internet, no follow through. They were, I think they're going to be behind at least 2 more years when we ever get back up and running. What is the Children's Defense Fund's goal moving forward, and how do we fix those problems?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. It has absolutely been a nearly 50-year fight for America's children, particularly Black and brown children, poor children. And our vision really is about making sure that those marginalized children get to flourish, that leaders, whether they're in policy leadership or corporate leadership, prioritize those children's well-being, and that the communities that surround those children actually have the power to ensure that they thrive. So this is about making sure that decision-making is closer to the people who actually care about those children. It's about investing in our organizing capacity. And it's about making sure that we redouble efforts to close these opportunity gaps for all of our children. So we're excited, just like you talk about kids being 2 years behind, we're excited that we're going to serve 10,000 children this summer at CDF Freedom Schools that are built on that Mississippi Freedom Summer model, teaching them about their own agency while teaching them literacy, teaching them that they can make a difference in themselves, in their families, in their communities, and in the country, so that they can pick up the baton that I don't want to lay down. I don't think Ms. Edelman's laid it down yet either, but we do want to pass it and hold it together for a while. We want to make sure that they're ready.
Well, she, no disrespect, but she's 81 years old, and I'm not saying that, I think the biggest fault of Black folk for the last 50 years is not grooming the next generation and not passing that baton. Listen, that fight in the streets is for people with the knee ligaments and the bone and the lack of arthritis who can get out there and do that. You need your elders to be there to guide. Like, there's a system, age-old African system of how this is supposed to go. We have not followed what the spirit said we should, and people in their 80s still out there running in the streets, and they should not be. Don't just say it. It's not right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way that we should protect and guard each other in as much as we support and guide each other, right? So it's for me, I mean, she and I were together on Friday, and we were talking about some of the shifts that we're making at the Children's Defense Fund. And so, I sit with her to get the counsel of the elder. And then there's also, and sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't, but there's also the work to protect the legacy. And in order to protect legacy, you can't do things the same way. You've got to shift to react to the new experiences. Because while we've been, in this work for 50 years, what we haven't seen in those 50 years? A pandemic. Because the last time we saw one of those was 100 years ago. And so these are the kinds of shifts that we can kind of take the essence of the wisdom, but we have to implement and execute in different ways because our children find themselves in different circumstances, right? We didn't live in a moment. CDF wasn't planted in a moment where a Black family had 10 times less wealth than a white family. And so we got to react to that racial wealth gap in a way that the previous leadership never had to. And so we've got to bring new tools to the fight.
When you talk about bringing new tools to the fight, Dr. Wilson, I think about, we sort of go to certain folks to give us a perspective on all of the noise that we hear about children, about what we need to do. And I think of, nobody better than Children's Defense Fund to think about that. The president just recently put forth his plan, his proposal, where he was talking about that they were going to cut that, the proposal would cut child poverty in half, essentially using tax credits to do that. Can you talk about, is there a way to will tax credits actually have that level of impact on children and the poverty levels? But one step further, poverty is a problem, but what happens? What's the impact on all the other things if we get poverty, if we decrease poverty for children, particularly Black children, right?
Yeah. No, I think what the president has proposed in the American Rescue Plan and what he's proposed, what he's advanced in the American Rescue Plan, what he's proposed in the American Families Plan, we support as a part of a long-term campaign that CDF has been in to end child poverty. Because we know that while ending poverty doesn't immediately create well-being, right, that poverty is a drag and a drain on educational opportunities, on access to healthcare, and on economic opportunities for our young people. And so this tool of the child tax credit is something that's been advanced. Basically, any child under the age of 6, you're going to be able to get a $3,000 credit for. Children 17 and under then get, I'm sorry, it's $3,600 for the younger children, $3,000 for the older children. And this is going to access, one of the values in the way this is done is that there are 23 million children in America who didn't get access to the previous child tax credit because their families earned too little, right? So they actually didn't earn enough to get full access to the credit because of how it was administered. So this expands to 23 million more children. There are also 1.1 out of every 7 children in America live in poverty. So you start talking about the dramatic impact of putting checks into the households starting in July. So in about 6 weeks, these checks will start getting cut. And you're talking about $300 per child on average receiving that in a household, and doing it in a way that's not just when you file your taxes after the fact, but doing so, this is another major innovation here, that we will get the checks, young people will get those to their parents on a monthly basis when the bills come due. So this is a significant intervention, but Drew, you make a remarkable point. Poverty, I was just having this conversation with our congressperson. I've been living in St. Louis for the last 20 years. Our congressperson, Congresswoman Cori Bush, straight out of the movement. And we're talking about how poverty is remarkably complex. It is not just an economic indicator. It has to do with all of these other things. It is systems that keep us tied in and tied down. And so in as much as this will help to lift the economic fortunes and create some stability and a ground upon which families can stand up, it creates opportunity to address the other things that we've come to identify with poverty, the lack of educational opportunities, the lack of housing. And we're glad that the Biden proposal has other things in there related to housing. So affordable housing supports, funds to affordable housing trust funds, and waivers. These are things that we continue to advocate about. And we continue to advocate in this moment to make some of the things that were common sense before a pandemic, let's just make them permanent. If it didn't make sense to test which child should be eligible for free lunch during a pandemic, it didn't make sense beforehand. So let's just have universal free school lunch. I was talking to a senator the other day. The reality is we have a public education system in America where everything is free but the food. Why isn't the food free? We know the nutrition is connected to young people's ability to focus and to learn. So the food should be free as well. So there's a lot for us to do. The child tax credit extension is important. They've proposed extending it through 2025. I'll just tell you, though, the Children's Defense Fund is not happy with that. We think it should be permanent.
Yeah.
I'll drop one last thing and I'll let it go. Every developed English-speaking nation, the UK, Canada, Australia, whatever it is, they have a permanent child allowance or some kind of family credit like what we have for a year that we're proposing to extend to 2025. My question is, if we're going to morally lead the world and talk about what other people should be doing, then shouldn't we take care of our own kids?
They say you can judge a society by how they treat its women and children.
Yes.
I think the problem, though, Dr. Starsky Wilson, who's here, of course, the chair, CEO of the Children's Defense Fund, Drew McCaskill's here as well, is that America is a hypocritical nation. It is built on a mythology and on a foundation of lies. So we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, while we literally hold people in bondage. Our first 5 of 7 presidents literally holding people in bondage, raping young girls, and so that foundation has to be reckoned with from a spiritual standpoint.
Yes.
From a spiritual standpoint, we can't really have these conversations because in the back of our spirit, we're like, they don't really care about these kids.
Yeah. And it really is. I mean, you talk about the deep spiritual and moral realities, the storytelling we have to do. I'm a preacher and I was raised and trained as a Baptist preacher, which means I tell the same story every Sunday. And so we got to get better at telling the truths of our story, right? Yesterday and today, we continue as a country to visit. Today, Biden is visiting and spending time talking about the Tulsa race massacre. If we don't talk about what that was, if we don't talk about the impact, if we don't talk about the degradation of Black hospitality, then we won't recognize the fact that Conrad Hilton could have been and should have been a Black man. We don't talk about the fact that when we talk about a racial wealth gap, it is deeply connected not just to white mobs, but white mobs that were supported and resourced with the implementation and the tools and the weapons of the state to strip wealth from Black communities. And so if we don't do that work, then we don't know what in the traditions of the church, we don't know what we need to confess and ask forgiveness for. And so we find ourselves holding ourselves out as saviors of the world rather than coming as sinners in need of God's grace. And if we took that posture, then we may have more of an openness to those spiritual elements such as atonement, needing to make things right with other people, sacrifice, needing to give of ourselves on behalf of others. These are spiritual concepts that we would come through if we would tell our stories more clearly and more accurately.
Dr. Wilson, Reverend Dr. Wilson, is the we the same we throughout your whole statement? Who's we? Who's
No,
the we you're talking
I
about?
think they're responsible. Yeah, I think there are we. I think that there is a we that's the same and consistent throughout my statements. Now, the reactions to the lessons should be different, but I think the lessons should be the same. America, all Americans need to tell the story of these massacres, these racialized conflagrations that happen all over our history. And our responses to that will be different, right? I've got to tell that story to my sons and to my daughter so they know not to rely on these systems to take care of them. And their friends who are white, who grow up in families that are well-resourced, need to learn that story so they don't get too excited about the fact that they have more than their Black counterparts because they know that it may have come from a place that wasn't the most respectable. And so they've got to react to that. So they don't think they're any better than my Black children, right? And so, yeah, we need to tell the same story, but we're always going to tell it from different angles and we will take different lessons from it.
We're in a screw face era where people no longer respect nor trust institutions across the board. And especially, I think a lot of Black institutions that have gotten a lot of George Floyd guilt money from corporations this past year, they're not trusted to actually deliver the goods to the people that they say they serve. And rightfully so. You know, we've had 50 years to watch many of these organizations sit on their hands and, you know, platitudes and annual conferences and dinners and things, raise money. But our conditions have been, you know, the wealth gap is greater before the pandemic. The health disparities greater, you know, the home ownership less, you know, before the pandemic. I don't know what the next 10 years are going to look like after this pandemic, because that's when we really see the fallout from this. How do we build trust, or do we need institutional organizations anymore?
Yeah, I think we do. I think there's a value in institutions. There's one who says that all movements need inspiring ideas, activated individuals, and strong institutions. You need all three to advance what King would talk about as a radical revolution of values, right? You can't just have an uprising in a moment, but you actually have to reform institutions. And I think we need them. Part of what we need, though, is we need to go back. I really appreciate the language from last year from Eddie Glaude, where he was really leaning in with Jimmy Baldwin and said we need to do our first works over. Part of what has happened is we've gotten too far established and too far from our origins. I can say this about all institutions because as a minister, I can say this about the church. The first century church that you see spoken about in the Bible is not the church that we live in today. It is not the post-Constantinian church where you now have the church aligned with the state. Institutions become aligned with the mainstream in the interest of their survival. So part of what we have to do is we have to go back to the very beginning, right? So if I talk about the origin story of the Children's Defense Fund, then I have to remember that much of that has to do with the bloated bellies of Black children in the Delta of Mississippi. And I can't come by this way of leading this institution from a DC perspective alone. I have to go back and spend time in the states where we have offices. I got to remember what I experienced here in the middle of the country in St. Louis. And I have to have, as I do always, the vision of a Mike Brown laying in the middle of the street, deeply cemented in my heart and in my mind to know what sends me forth into this work, right? I have to remember my own story of a big brother cut down from community violence and gun violence, from drug turf battles in the streets in my own upbringing to bring that earnestly to the work. And so while I was raised in the era of code switching and knowing how to go along and get along and how to present in certain environments and others, I have to be real about the pain if I'm really going to implement a program that means something. And so part of what our institutions have to do is to make sure that we are investing some of the resources from this new moment into organizing, into listening, into lifting up the stories of the people who put us to work in the very first place. Because if we don't, then we will fail our people in as much as America has failed our institutions and our movement.